I'm Will Glazik. I work for Brucker Crop Service over in Aerosmith, Illinois. It's Central Illinois region. I farm as well. I work in soil fertility and management, as well as starting to utilize cover crops, and work pretty much in Central Illinois, but then across all of Illinois.
My name's Adam Thorndike. I'm from Piper City, Illinois, also not too far from Will. Farm about 2,000 acres, 2,300 acres between my dad and I. Been doing cover crops for about 4 years and still learning, still experimenting, so feel free to ask questions. We're gonna kind of go through what it takes to get started with cover crops. So we're gonna start out with your cash crop. You're gonna start with, you wanna make sure if you're going into standing corn with your cover crops, you need to plan out your corn hybrids. You wanna make sure you've got something that's going to get sunlight on the row fairly quick. You're also going to want to look into your herbicide program. Make sure the cover crop you want to use will not be affected by the herbicide program you are using. We've got a study out this year. We had to change our herbicide program in one field. We're doing red clover, radish, and rapeseed in 120-foot strips on a farm, and then the other 120-foot strips are ryegrass, radish, and rapeseed. We're going to see how much nitrogen we can scavenger or produce with the clover, and see if we can cut back on some of our input cost of putting extra nitrogen out to feed the corn. This is our first year with this, so.
And this is in a corn-on-corn field. Getting started, I think one of the best cover crops to utilize would be cereal rye after corn harvest ahead of soybeans. It can be easily managed. Again, like Adam said, typically with cereal rye, we don't run into too many carryover problems on herbicide, but it's important to have a early season corn hybrid to get that off and then get the rye put on earlier in the fall to get more growth, as well as when you're planting your corn production, a little added nitrogen will help stimulate the rye in the fall. And then going back to what Sarah said, if you're transitioning from a conventional tillage system, this offers a really easy way to get the rye onto the field, is to come in with a fertilizer spreader, a little bit of fertilizer blended with some cereal rye, and then you can work it in with a vertical tillage tool or a disc with a good harrow.
In our operation, we are doing fertilizer in strips and then coming back in and plant onto those strips. You'll see some pictures in here of me putting fertilizer on while I'm also doing the strips on corn. There's a lot of pictures of that from this fall. It's the field that we're doing the study on with the clover. I've got a few pictures. I'm not sure if they're on here or not, but I've got a few more pictures that I can show you later if you would like about cover crops following soybeans, where we are stripping fertilizer into that. There's spots that it looks like it's a yard almost. It's that green, which is what you want. You want the greenness to stay there. You want that plant to stay alive as long as you can to help feed the microbes in your soil. Here's a picture from when we first started doing cover crops. These two pictures here. This was the first year we done it. Didn't know what to expect. They were seeded, I think, end of August, right before Labor Day weekend. And then the following, 2 days later, we got a 2-inch rain on them. This was following beans. The beans were just starting to turn yellow. When it rained, it was enough that it knocked the leaves off the beans. So the bean leaves created a mulch on top of the cover crop seed, which helped keep it cool and keep the moisture on it to allow it to germ. This is a picture from when I was getting ready to terminate it the following spring. This was annual ryegrass with radishes. You can see my strips in there from applying fertilizer with falling fall. So like I said, this is how we do it. We're still working with the corn on corn version. We're gonna try it a little more this year. We're also going to this will be my first year of planting soybeans into green cereal rye. See what happens. Will got me convinced on doing this, so we'll see. We've had issues with weeds this year on a couple of farms, so one of these is got cover crops on it, so we're gonna try the cover crops to see if it'll prevent the weeds from growing and allow us to get a better yield on a crop and not have to spend as much money on herbicide.
Our area is pretty well infested with glyphosate resistant water hemp, and so far I haven't found any palmer, but if you look at a state map, it's all the way around us, but I don't think it's actually been documented in Ford County. And along with glyphosate resistance, we've also found PPO resistance and ALS resistance. So that really limits the herbicides we're able to use in soybeans. And green cereal rye has been a phenomenal herbicide, really, in soybeans. We let it get up, sometimes, and you can see some of these pictures, it's almost as tall as I am. That's on some really fertile ground. And then you no-till right into that. I do own a roller crimper, so I'm hoping Adam is going to use it. When you roller crimp the rye and get it flat on the ground, we'll spray it first, and it's very glyphosate sensitive. Even at 4, 5, 6 feet tall, a quart of glyphosate will knock it flat with good rates of AMS, and we're using about 15 gallons of water per acre and about 2 pounds of dry AMS and a quart of glyphosate. It seems to work very well. Then let that crisp up a little bit, come in with a roller crimper and lay it down flat. That tends to let the soybeans get the sunlight a little faster. That's also going to hold back the moisture in the ground a little longer. And we found we haven't had as hard of a issue with slugs and voles when the rye is down on the ground versus when it's still standing up in the air.
As far as seeding options, Sarah kind of mentioned that you got the Hagee option. You got you can plant it. There's guys that are doing precision planting. I've seen a couple of pictures here of Will's that are he's got twin rows the way it looked. He's got, what do you got in those? Clover was one of them, wasn't it? And
well, that was a bio strip till. So some of the earlier pictures, it's looks like a cultivator with some disc openers on it, and then it has a Gandy box in the middle. And what that's used for is after early soybeans, and a full season soybean in our area would be a 3.6, and in this case we're using a 2.6 or a 2.8 soybean, so we can get the soybeans off in September 15th, September 20th, and turn right around and plant something along the lines of crimson clover and annual ryegrass in between the row, and then right on the row we'll use either radishes if it's early enough, or if we're pushing October, we'll use rapeseed. That concentrates the nutrients right in a band that we then no-till corn on top of. We don't kill the annual ryegrass and the crimson clover until 3 or 4 days after the corn's planted and it's about ready to come up. That helps with a couple of things. So it helps with planting because we don't have to worry about going in with a burn down real early. But then it also helps with the cover crop growth because it allows time for the cover crop to have some heat units to really get up and growing. And then while it's growing, it's easier to kill with systemic herbicides like glyphosate.
So going back to what I started to say there about the planting, there's guys that are using 15-inch row planter. You can plant grass with a wheat plate or soybean plate, which Kinsey, or you can get them some other places also. You can do the Hagee, you can do an airplane. I've seen guys using helicopters before. we've had an airplane do it once, and then the other 2 times or 3 times we've done cover crops, we've had a Hagee do it. Either Trenton or there's another guy in the area that's got one. We like getting it on. We choose the Hagee over the airplane because the Hagee can get closer to the edge of the field versus the airplane. We have a couple farms that we did this on that have trees on 3 sides, and the airplane didn't get close enough to the trees. There was about a 20-foot spot that they missed along the edge next to the trees, where the ground rig can get in the corners a little bit better and get closer to the trees and not have to worry about the trees, blocking the seed from getting to the ground.
This is that bio strip till bar. And the other thing about a Hagee versus an airplane is it basically has a meter drill box that then blows out to the edges. So if you're wanting to use a cocktail mix and you have maybe 3 or 4 different seeds and they're all different sizes and different weights, if you're flying out of an airplane, those tend to separate. So maybe your oats go all the way out to the width, but then your radishes are in the middle, and then your annual ryegrass doesn't have enough weight to go out. So then you end up with streaks throughout the field. Airplanes work pretty good on square fields with limited obstructions and single species.
I guess we can go into termination now. SARE, on SARE's handout, I saw that, and I've been told this also, but you want to make sure that the air temperatures in mid-40s or warmer during the day when you're spraying. You don't want to go out first thing in the morning and try and terminate it. You want the grass and that to, like I say, warm up, I'm going to call it awake for lack of terms. You want it to start being actively growing during the day when you go to try and terminate it, so it absorbs the herbicides quicker and will terminate quicker and better that way, versus going out and spraying it when it's starting to shut down for the day. Stuff like that is things you think about. What else you want to...
I mean, with soybeans into cereal rye, it's not that big of a deal because typically you'll be planting a little later into the year, and cereal rye is very glyphosate sensitive, and that's our primary burn down herbicide of choice. If we're trying to terminate annual ryegrass ahead of corn, like Adam said, it's going to be a little bit cooler, so you need to make sure that it's sprayed on a sunny day with temperatures above 50, preferably over 55. And that's why, to get started, we try to use either a broadleaf ahead of corn that we can kill with a 2,4-D or a dicamba product, and then, or pretty much stick to winter-killed cover crops like oats and rapeseed, radishes. Those won't... You're not going to get as noticeable effects right off the bat, and it'll take a longer time to really start to see the benefits. But you will have some cover, you will have some residue left on the fields going through the winter, and it'll be easy to manage in the spring. So here's a really good picture about planting into green cereal rye. This is something I've done myself for 2 years. I've roller crimped ahead of planting and then planted into green and roller crimped afterwards. For my older planter, it tends to do better when I rolled first. That way I wasn't moving through as much residue. But on the newer planters that have good tight disc openers, where the gauge wheels are up close to the disc openers, those tend to plant just fine into green rye, and then or standing rye. And the standing rye is a little easier to get your seed slot closed versus with the rolled rye. Another thing with planting in the rye that might be a little counterintuitive, it tends to be easier to get the planter into the ground if we take off the row cleaners and if we take off the coulters. That seems to be, unless you can have a really heavy planter, that seems to be too much friction and holds a planter up out of the ground. Even with 300 pounds of downforce on airbags, we lift the coulters and lift the row cleaners, Good sharp double disc openers will make enough of a slot to get a soybean planted, and then either cast iron or rubber closing wheels in our high organic matter soils tend to do well. I also know people that have had good luck with the furrow cruisers, which are the kind of half rubber, half spike, or even a spiked wheel.
Just going through some pictures here. This is a radish that, like I said, this was back from the first year we had cover crops back in 2012. I just was out driving around one day and stopped by here and just look at it, see what it was looking like, and those radishes were that size, and that was back in like March or late February, early March. It's still plenty cold out, but it wasn't. They hadn't totally died yet and decayed. There was just some pictures that I found that had somewhat overwintered. Not all of them will overwinter. Some do, some don't. I don't really know how to explain that, but they just do. I had something, I just lost it. I don't remember where I was going.
So what about herbicides for annual ryegrass? What's like the go-to system to really manage annual ryegrass well?
For annual ryegrass, the key is to make sure it never puts on a seed head. If it starts to joint and lignify, it's going to be really tricky to kill. We've had good success with paraquat or gramoxone. We've had fairly good success with 2 passes of glyphosate. With atrazine seems to do, but you kind of got to watch it because you don't want to have too much atrazine in there that's antagonistic to the glyphosate. We haven't had, as long as the growing conditions are fit, and that's why I like this bio strip. So we can wait until it's a little bit warmer, and we have a little longer growing or a little more growing season. Seems to make it easier to kill the annual ryegrass. I was in the front when Sarah asked the question. How many are using cover crops currently? How many are in here that would like to use cover crops or have heard, but they're not sure how to get started? Those of you that have heard that are not sure where to get started, what questions do you have before you make the jump?
I'm new to farming, so
Okay.
I'm not currently a farmer.
All right.
I'm fine. Just everything started.
And those of you that are currently using cover crops, have you moved beyond? Are you using cereal rye and soybeans and having success with that? You want to move to some other things that we're trying and experimenting with?
Well, I know at my farm there's a field across from the farmhouse that we haven't really been using, and we're going to start an orchard over there. And with that, we were going to do some like strawberry clover, since it's a real like low light kind of plant. So we're definitely looking into that as well as sunflowers.
I don't have any experience with strawberry clover, but white Dutch clover is one thing that I'm looking into on my own farm. The plan would be so I'm on a corn, soybean, wheat rotation, and the plan would be to utilize red clover and white Dutch frost seeded into the wheat. Then we would do fall strips and maybe put a winter kill brassica on those strips, and then using the white Dutch clover as a living mulch in between the corn plants the following year. So I think the strawberry or the white would be good in your situation.
Some of the stuff we're using this year, we got a little bit more advanced this year, I guess you could say. In the past, we've only done ryegrass and radish, mainly annual rye and radish. This year we're doing annual rye, radish, and rapeseed. We've got annual rye, we got radish, and I think we've got mustard. We've got some that's annual rye. We've got some that's got annual rye, winter barley, and radish. We have radish in that mix, I think. As well as cereal rye and radish and rapeseed. We've even threw some mustard in on some of the fields that are going into soybeans this next year. We've heard that there's a little bit of research showing that the mustard will produce a gas that will help with the nematodes in soybeans. So we're gonna try that, see if there's any truth to that, or if we can get that to work to help with nematodes. In my area, not just us, but the neighbors as well as us, so we're having problems growing soybeans in our area. No matter what we do, we can't get above about 55 bushel an acre. We should be producing 65, 70 bushel beans in our area where we're at. So like I said, we're trying to see what we can do to improve our yields. That's part of our plan, or what our goal is with this, as well as building soil health, figuring out a way to get our soils healthy. As they said this morning in the farmer panel this morning, you got to have soil health to get your cash crops to grow. You can't just go out there and throw fertilizer out there to make your crops grow. The salt and the fertilizers, if you put too much fertilizer out there, you're getting too much salt out there, so it's making your ground less productive instead of more productive. So we got to figure out a way to get the ground back to how Mother Nature, or how it was given to us. We got to get it back to that condition if we expect to keep farming or keep making a living from farming.
Those of you using cover crops, is this something that you decided to do on your own, or are you working with an agronomist to figure out some of the different challenges as you decide to expand on covers?
Working on our own for right now. Just trying to figure out what we're going to do. I mean, we're asking questions, but we really don't know what questions to ask.
Would there be a cover crop agronomist in your area?
Other than the universities or the elevators, they're trying to help you, but we're getting the same. We're getting the same answers from both of them. You were talking about stripping. Did I miss something? What do you mean by stripping?
We're putting our fertilizer down in strips.
Well, you're talking about strip tilling.
Correct, strip till fertilizer, and then come back and planting on that row, or where the fertilizer is. There's pictures in
The
here.
other stuff blank then? I mean, not covering.
No, there's cover crops. We're going in. We seeded our cover crops in the summer or late summer here, right before harvest. And yeah, here Will's gonna get them up. We go in and then seed our cover crops in the standing crop, and then you want to show that video? I've got a video here.
At the top.
The video's right here.
Oh yeah.
She's got it open for us. Here's a short video I did a couple weeks ago. This is, you can kind of see the cover crops here. This was going back to your hybrids. This field had about 4 different hybrids on it across this 160 acres. This here where I'm at now was 105-day corn. It was the first we took off. The cover crops here were a lot better now. You can still see them. Where when we went across this field, the further over I got, where the different varieties of corn were, you could see less and less and less of the cover crops. Just they didn't get as much sunlight. This, like I said, this here was 105-day. It was taken out around the 25th of September. So it's had 3 or 4 more weeks of sunshine versus the rest of the field.
So you put cover crop on this before you harvested?
Correct.
Yes, we went in with the Hagee
Just
and
repeat what he just said. Repeat what he just said.
The question is, did we put cover crops on this before harvest? Yes. We went in late August and put ryegrass, radish, and rapeseed And also, this is the farm that's got the 120-foot strips on it. So there's 120-foot strips of radish, ryegrass, rapeseed, and radish, rapeseed, and red clover. This was seeded in last week, August, second to last week, August. So like I said, this was after, not after, but this was harvested, and middle into September is when this was harvested.
And
I'm from Michigan,
Okay.
so I'm a little bit farther north
Yep.
than you guys are. My corn is really green when you guys are putting this stuff on. I mean, is that the time I'm gonna have to start putting my cover crop on too?
the corn was extremely green when we went in August. And what we kind of found with the red clover, I'm excited to see how it turns out in the spring. I think red clover is pretty winter hardy, and it'll be one of the early things to green up. But where I'm used to utilizing red clover in wheat, the kind of cover mat that I get is a lot more than what we did in the corn on corn.
Okay, so how high is your red clover and the wheat when you're harvesting? When you're harvesting wheat and
I'll harvest wheat in July, sometimes the end of June on an early year.
okay,
If it's a late year and I get into the middle of July, I might be cutting off the tops of red clover.
okay, now do you sell your straw or what do you do with your straw?
No, I keep all the straw, just give it back to the ground. There's a lot of nutrient value and residues that I don't want to sell off the farm.
Okay, so how do you handle the extra trash?
I might have deleted it.
Did you? Sarah might have deleted my picture.
Well, he gave me 200 pictures.
No, the residue, once the soils become biologically active, and you're rotating high carbon covers with legumes, so your low carbon covers, they'll break down, and it just starts adding organic matter to the soil, and it's pretty. So here's the Hagee seeding into the red clover, but once the soil is active and you balance your nitrogen ratios, trying to hit about 25-30 carbons to 1 nitrogen, and when you get that and you have your active soil, the residues aren't an issue. They just start going back to the soil.
And you have no problem with the red clover coming up through that because it's already growing. Okay, so your stubble, you leave your stubble quite high then too?
Right. So in the wheat will be seeded in the fall,
Yeah.
and then in February, March, April, then I'll come in with 5 pounds of mammoth red clover, 5 pounds of medium red clover, and 2 to 3 pounds of white Dutch, and then that'll grow up.
You put fertilizer in with this or?
No.
Just,
How are you seeding that?
yeah.
I've got a 4-wheeler and a little spinner, and we'll do about 200 acres like that every spring.
In the explain freeze thaw.
Explain
for us.
So with frost seeding, you can get away with this with hard seeds like your clovers, and you lay them out on top, and then as the ground as the temperatures start to warm up, that top is going to thaw out, and then at night it's going to freeze, and then that's going to expand and contract. And because clovers are so small, you can't really plant them that deep. But this freeze thaw action will plant the clover at the perfect depth. Then as the temperatures warm up and the wheat comes out of dormancy, the clovers are going to be growing with the wheat. As they continue to grow, the wheat will put on a head and really shade out the clovers, which suppresses them pretty heavily until the wheat starts to die down. The canopy opens up, the clovers come back up underneath. You come in with a platform head, you cut off the tops, then you really open up the canopy that allows sunlight to hit the red clover. The clover comes up really dramatically, Then where we have fences, I'll bring in cows and graze that and can get 3 pounds of gain per day on, and we try to stock them about 1,500 pounds per acre and can get about 3 pounds of gain per day. Rotate them around through the red clover, or where I don't have fences, we'll just go in with a sickle mower and then mow it down.
You just leave it?
Yeah.
And then what do you do when you go to corn?
And then, so that'll be, right now, I haven't got my no-till corn figured out yet, or the strip till yet. So I'll work that up in early September, and so it'll be a clean tilled field, and then I'll come in with a cover crop of oats, spring peas, crimson clover, radishes, and rapeseed. And I'll broadcast that and harrow it over the worked field. That comes up, and right now I've got about 1.5 feet or more of growth. After last night, it probably frosted off, and then the plan is to no-till corn into that residue come spring.
So you're putting two cover crops on it?
Right, and that's my fertility program. I don't buy any inputs.
So Adam, could you talk about staggering the maturities of corn and soy, and then how that allows?
Oh, here we go. There's the red clover
Oh.
in the wheat.
So once you cut the red clover, it's dead?
No, it'll overwinter and
No,
come.
but I mean, you said that you went in with the sickle bar
Right,
and cut,
and that's for weed control.
yeah.
And then it'll come back again, and then I'll go disc it. And it takes about 2 passes with a disc and 1 with a field cultivator.
What happens if I don't want to go in there with a disc?
We'll just spray it.
Okay, so you're killing it with the disc instead of with the spray.
Right.
Okay.
And in that case, let it overwinter, let it come up in the spring, and then hit it with 2,4-D and Roundup, go plant corn.
It's not either. Can't find it right now. So
Are you saying kill it in September and then, or let it go?
No. In your case, if you're using herbicide, you can let that grow through the winter. You'll keep your ground covered. In the spring, it'll start producing more nitrogen, and then probably 2 weeks before you want to plant corn, I would burn it down with a Roundup 2,4-D or a dicamba. Maybe put a residual with it, and then go plant corn. Yeah.
And about the herbicides mixed with your burn downs, any issues with your freeze, no matter what you use, mixed with your Roundup at the time of termination?
Are you asking if on the pre-herbicides and the burn down, is this ahead of corn or ahead of beans?
Kind of beans. Beans or corn, I guess. Is there any issues?
We haven't seen that many issues ahead of the beans, and I haven't done much research at all ahead of the corn. And on the beans, where we have really tall rye, we basically cut out our pre's and save that money if we need to come in post. Most of the time, if we've had a thick enough cover of rye, a burn down of glyphosate is the only herbicide we need.
So Sarah was asking about the maturities of the corn. You want to make sure that if you're gonna decide to do cover crops, you're gonna want to plant a variety of corn that you can get off early to get your cover crops to get sunlight sooner in the fall, so they can get established better. They'll get established while the corn's still growing, but just the more sunlight you get to them quicker, the quicker they'll expand and grow and do more benefit before it gets cold. Depends on what you're using. Some may not overwinter. Your radishes will not overwinter. Cereal rye will. Cereal rye you can go out and plant now or in January, March, February, whenever you want to. I used to be a seed dealer, and one of our training meetings, one of the guys was doing research of going out in January after a frost one morning, he went out and seeded 10 acres or just playing around. And besides top growth, you couldn't tell any difference of where he seeded in fall versus winter versus spring. Yeah, they got taller, but you don't always want the tallness in your you don't necessarily want the tallest plants out there. You're trying to improve your soil, so you want something that's going to grow more roots than necessarily top growth. So that's something else to think about, is what you want your cover crops to provide you. Are you trying to scavenge your nutrients? Are you trying to break up hard pan? Are you trying to build soil health types? That those are all questions you got to ask yourself. What do I want this to benefit me? Which one's more important first? Do I break up compaction? Do I build soil health? Like I said, you need to go through and prioritize what you want to do first, and then figure out what you want to do for cover crops, and then maybe plan your cash crops around your cover crops. Make it all one big plan that you can go in and this is what I'm going to do, so I can't use this herbicide or type something like that. So like I said, that goes back to your corn maturity. Another thing to look at on your corn is your leaf orientation. Yeah, you're going to get more yield for a corn hybrid that's got more of not really an outright, I've been called an outright leaf versus an upright leaf. But if you're wanting to cover crop, you're going to want a corn that's got more of an upright leaf, that you can get more sunlight on the ground quicker. They always told us when I was selling seed that if you've got at least 50% sunlight on your rows on the ground, that's when you can start applying cover crops. So if you've got a leafy hybrid that's got the outright wide leaves, it's going to take longer to get 50% sunlight to your ground. Where if you have an upright leaf or narrow leafed corn, you'll be able to get sunlight to your ground quicker and get your cover crops on it quicker and get them established quicker.
What about using wheat as a cover crop?
I've used wheat as a cover crop with a couple of the farmers I work with. It's in those cases we normally use it in place of cereal rye, and we'll burn it down early because it won't necessarily get as much growth. And
Plant it later?
no, we'll plant rye much later than we would wheat. We'll try to get wheat in our area. We'll try to get wheat planted by October 20th, no later than Halloween. And a customer of mine was planting rye yesterday. So we'll see how it does. And with rye, I talk about rye just because it's probably the number one go-to cover crop of choice for me. It's pretty economical and it's easy to manage, and it has a lot of good benefits to it. And I use it primarily to get people started as a weed control tactic. It against your amaranth and pigweed species, it rocks. And when we're talking on herbicide programs, we talk about our modes of action and overlaying residuals to maximize modes of action in the field for weed control. I think rye has 5 modes of action in itself. Number one, it's going to be competitive against a growing weed for nutrients and water. It's also going, as it dies, is going to utilize available nitrate in the soil and to break down the high carbon lignin in the rye, which will pull that out of the soil for weeds to use. So that's why it works really well with soybeans, or like Sarah was talking about, putting down a really strong starter. It does have allelopathic chemicals in it. And then the mulch itself is a physical barrier as well as a temperature barrier. And if you can keep the soils cooler by limiting the amount of direct sunlight, your summer annual weeds have a germinating temperature of about that 75 to 80 range. And only on a very few extremely hot days when I was checking temperature did I ever see the surface temp underneath the rye go over 78 degrees. And that was when air temp was 95.
But you got your, well, they're gone now. You had your strip right there. What is, you're gonna plant in that strip there? Is that what you're gonna do?
Yeah, so this is a mix of crimson clover and annual ryegrass, and then this was a row of radishes. So we'll come in and plant corn right onto this strip, and this is the farmer that I work with down around Champaign. He originally was using strip till and banding the fertilizer, but then found that it wasn't necessary anymore. So he broadcasts his fertilizer, but still plants corn on that strip. And we're taking soil samples in that row of dead radishes in the spring, and 15 inches back in between these two rows of annual ryegrass. And we found 50% higher concentrations of sulfur, 50% higher concentrations of excuse me, potassium, and 30% higher concentrations of phosphorus in that dead radish row than 15 inches off on either side. So he's backing down his pop-up, his phosphorus starter, because he's already banned his nutrients with his cover crop.
And when is a system like this usually planted?
So we try to get this on and before September 20th, and that gives us about a month and a half of growing season. Is that a question in the back? It really does require a lot of light and heat. So in this case, we haven't seen a significant yield drag by bumping up the maturity on our soybeans, and this farmer has seen an increase in profits by cutting back on his fertilizer plan because he's now dedicated to utilizing the cover crops rather than fertilizer.
So what about messing with N, P, and K in general, going to corn or for soybeans, P and K? When cover crops are in the system, what have you changed, or any differences there with customers?
So far on our farm, we have not changed anything as far as our fertility program. We're still trying to learn. Maybe next year, in a couple of years, we'll start seeing if lower rates of fertilizer will help us or hurt us. We'll see this fall or this next spring when we get our results back from the clover, whether or not the clover will pay for itself by reducing the amount of N we have to put out there, by pulling the N out of the soil, saving the N type thing. Same way with the radish. Like he was saying, the radish is going to pull the nutrients out of the soil that you're not using and store them, and then as it decays, it's going to release that fertilizer nutrients back into the soil.
With a strong, healthy legume cover crop, I've found that I don't need to apply any nitrogen. I do soil test, and when needed, apply P, K, and secondary micronutrients. Over time, as you get a cycling soil that's continuing to grow and break down and decompose, I think you can start to minimize on your fertility inputs, but I would only do it based on an accurate soil test.
So how often do you soil test?
Annually.
And how do you do it on a grid, on a soil type?
Mine is based on zones, so it's normalized yield zones.
How big are zones?
Up to 10 acres. Anywhere from a half acre up to 10 acres on the size of the yield zones.
And so can you clarify just a large, healthy legume cover crop? How is that possible? And so if you can't do that, what would NP and K be in a 2-year system where you couldn't grow legumes?
So, and this doesn't only apply to legumes, but to get a large, healthy cover crop, you'll either have to have a year of fallow or follow a small grains crop to where you have a summer growing season. And in that case, you can maximize your growth potential of your cover crop, which is important if you're going to start cutting back on inputs. In a corn and bean rotation where we don't have the opportunity for 6 months of growth or 4 months of growth, typically we're not cutting back on nitrogen, but with your high residue cover crops like cereal rye or annual ryegrass, those are going to start to add a lot of potassium as they excrete it from the clay in the soil and break down. And then the phosphorus as well. If you can squeeze in a cover crop of buckwheat, will really help release a lot of potentially available phosphorus. But over time, as these cover crops start dying and cycling, again, look at your soil tests and see where you can cut back. But in a corn bean rotation, cutting back on nitrogen is not one, because you won't have enough growing season to get the full lush legume to eliminate nitrogen. But this is the trial that we're doing with Adam here, is to see how much nitrogen can we cut back when we put the red clover out there in standing corn in a corn-on-corn rotation.
Okay, so what about the agronomist seed salesman discussion? And so you and Will have a good relationship, and so he's pushing you a bit, and you're willing, and so how unique is that? And then how would you suggest that other farmers work with their agronomists to help make cover crops really work? And maybe you'll have to repeat that because I don't know.
So she's asking Will's and mine relationship being dealer farmer. We've been trying cover crops for a couple of years. Like I said, this is my first year working with Will. Before, we just been doing mixes that the dealership that I sold for offered. After talking to Will, he's had a little bit more experience than what I was ever presented with as a dealer. He had, I don't know if say research, but he had a lot more stuff available, seeds available, different ideas available than what I was ever offered as a dealer. So that's why we switched and went with him this year. And also he had the Hagee that he could apply the seed via ground and not via airplane. Like I said, that's why we went that way.
And it was about this time last year, we sat down and had a cup of coffee and a little coffee cake and decided what and looked at what kind of agronomic issues do we want to address? Do we want to address nematodes? Do we want to address weeds? Do we want to address compaction? Do we want to cut back on nutrients? So, and we went through and put together mixes for certain fields to address specific agronomic situations. And I think that's pretty important.
Yes.
So do you go back and communicate with other service providers that you deal with, or are you doing everything on your own and so you kind of make your own decisions?
We do most of the stuff on our own, so we make our own decisions. I apply all my own herbicides. I get my stuff from a local guy that's got his own business. If I have questions, I can ask him, and he knows a lot about a lot, so it's kind of hard to get him confused, or not confused, but for him not to give you the right answer. He's trying to cover crops himself on a few of his acres and has been happy with it, so must be doing something right if he's willing to try it. So
And then I would just recommend finding an agronomist in your area, maybe starting with the local soil and water conservation district to see who they would recommend, or a local extension agent, because cereal rye is pretty easy to work with. But as we expand into different brassicas or different legumes or even some different grasses, it's going to be more and more important, especially on herbicides. We did the same corn on corn trial on a different field, and there was a little leftover seed, so we hopped across the ditch and did another strip there where we had used some impact herbicide instead of just the glyphosate plan in the original planned area. And turns out that red clover does not like impact. There wasn't a single seed that germinated and grew. Where we just had the glyphosate herbicide program, it was fine. It came up, it looked good, it was healthy. And so it's important, if you're going to try some of these expanding idea cover crops, to make sure that everyone's on board. And in Adam's case, where he's doing a lot of his own application, he can make that call. But then if you're having a custom applicator come in and do it, make sure you're on the same page. Make sure they know what you're trying to do, so that that's not detrimental to your soils and your cover crops.